Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Ben, and this is another installment of Fresh Read Kills. So, Fresh Read Kills is where I talk about the latest things that I have read. I've had a pretty good, uh, I would say, stretch of reading, really from August through September and into October. The books that I finished that I'm going to be talking about are ones that I finished in the second half of September. I am currently reading, and you can see I'm almost done with Between Two Fires, An Epic Tale of Medieval Horror by Christopher Buehlman. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. This is a buddy read that I'm doing with Steve from Steve Talks About Books and Stuff. And I am really enjoying this. So this is something I'll certainly be talking about on the next episode that I do of Fresh Read Kills. As for the stuff that I finished, the first thing was Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Originally published, blanking on the year here for a second, 1938. And I read this as kind of a buddy / group read, a trio read. I don't know what you call it when there's three of us. But with Mark from Book Time with Elvis and with Michael K. Vaughan, two of my favorite booktubers. They're both great guys. It was great to have a buddy read with them. I hope to do it again. I think we're all of similar mind about this book. Rebecca is certainly a gothic novel. I think as Michael K. Vaughan mentioned in his video about this book, sometimes it is kind of referred to as horror as well, but it is not at all. I think this little tagline here that they've added, the classic tale of romantic suspense. That's probably the best way to put it. It does sometimes enter the gothic, but it's not entirely there. And what we have is this young woman who we don't have a name for. We're never given a name of our main protagonist. She is young, sort of naive, and she's working for this rich, kind of snobbish and garish American. And I think where is she? Monte Carlo? Is that where she is? And she meets this wealthy widower named Maxim. And they end up kind of falling in love. She marries Maxim, and she goes back to the very famous estate of this gentleman, Manderley. And the very opening words, of course, are kind of iconic at this point. Last night I dreamt I went to Manderley again. And we know right from the very beginning of this novel that they are not living in Manderley, and that Manderley is maybe not in good shape. But Manderley seems haunted, not literally, but by the memory of Maxim's first wife, Rebecca. Everywhere that this protagonist goes, she's kind of reminded of Rebecca. I think that's maybe why she's not given a name. I was actually expecting something a little bit more along the lines of she was almost taking on aspects of Rebecca, imitating Rebecca. It doesn't really go there. I kind of wish it did. I had seen the Hitchcock version of this a few years ago now, so I had a foggy memory of what was going to happen. I didn't know how closely it would stick to the book, and it turns out that the movie does stick fairly close to the book. There are a few changes that had to be made, I'm guessing because of the Hays Code and censors regarding Maxim, but otherwise it stays fairly close. But nevertheless, we have this character who is insecure, and that can honestly, by the middle of the book, can start grating on your nerves. You kind of want her to get some confidence. And when she finally does, it does occur, but I wish that it was a little more satisfying when it did. But she is essentially operating for a very long time on false assumptions. False assumptions about Rebecca, about Maxim, about a lot of what people are kind of telling her or telegraphing to her. She is misunderstanding, and she is operating on false assumptions. And I think that, it's likely that the reader will pick up on some certain ththings before the protagonist does. Nevertheless, she has a certain nemesis in this house, in this estate, called Mrs. Danvers, who we find was basically, in love with Rebecca, does not want to see Rebecca replaced at this estate. And Mrs. Danvers is a very fascinating and creepy character. I really liked her. I liked the way that she was written. Although at a certain point she's, as far as a woman who is essentially, their housekeeper, the head of the house, other housekeepers, I feel like she goes way too far quite often, to the point where it passes credulity for me that she wouldn't just be thrown out of the house and have a restraining order put on her. But nevertheless, we follow our main protagonist, and as she's living at Manderley, and she never feels like she's going to live up to the memory that people have of Rebecca. And then we get a sharp left turn. There's a twist that I'm sure a lot of people would see coming. And the book takes on a little bit more of like a police procedural, where there's a certain mystery, non-mystery that is unfolding. And at that point, I thought it was very odd. The protagonist kind of takes a backseat. She becomes no longer the driving force in the story, but she becomes more of a spectator. And we see other people sort of taking on the reins of moving the plot along, and she is just kind of there along for the ride. Sometimes literally. Sometimes she's like just in a car riding along. And that stuff is okay. It did leave me a little bit unsatisfied, though, as things went. I kind of wish that certain resolutions had a little more impact. But all that said, I thought the writing in this was, especially in the first half, was excellent. I think that du Maurier, her prose is often terrific. I do really like a lot of the dialogue. I like the characters. Maxim, I thought, was actually a pretty great character. And the way that she describes Manderley, you really get a sense of place. It's its own character. She talks about flowers a lot and plants, and I do not know much about those things. I had to keep looking up what do rhododendrons look like and all that. And I think that she does that because those were choices of Rebecca to decorate the estate. She was a plant person, and we find out in the very beginning that our protagonist is more of an animal person. The only time we really find out about our protagonist's preferences is in the very beginning, before she starts looking back on things, and she kind of prides herself as being somebody who knows a lot about the animals in an area. So I think that was kind of something of a contrast, where she is attached to the wildlife, and Rebecca is more represented by the foliage, and not just any kind of foliage, but also maybe foliage that takes over areas, and like a weed, or like a vine, a creeping vine almost, something that would strangle. Anyway, those are just my thoughts. Once again, I did like Rebecca. I certainly enjoyed it. I thought it was a very good novel. I was slightly underwhelmed, especially at the end. I wish that certain things had, just had more of an impact overall. But I did think it was very good, and I would overall recommend it, just as long as you know what you're getting into. And I would certainly do another buddy read with Mark and Michael. September is also a time where there were two different celebrations going on from the same time period. So the first one, I think, it's called Tudortember. I don't have all the information about that in front of me. I kind of almost unconsciously started reading something for it, but I'll try and figure that stuff out and put it down in the description. But from what my understanding is, Tudortember is basically just let's explore or / celebrate the Tudor era. So I had this book on the shelf for a long time, and I finally read it. And that's Ruth Goodman's How to Behave Badly in Elizabethan England. A guide for knaves, fools, harlots, cuckolds, drunkards, liars, thieves, and braggarts. Quite a list, right? And essentially, this is a popular history that is a social history about life in Elizabethan era, and what was considered proper, what was not, how could you go about really pissing people off. And this was a lot of fun. She has a really good sense of humor. Like, for instance, she made me laugh out loud at one point. She gave an example of a very long-winded sentence from a letter that just kind of seemed to go on forever. And she followed it up with, "Have you lost the will to live yet?" after reading that. And I thought that was pretty funny. So she is very matter-of-fact. And this gets into a lot of things. The first chapter was offensive speech. Like this, I like this. A turd in your teeth. Of course, the modern equivalent would be like, eat shit. But that's what we have for the Elizabethan age. And just the turns of phrase back then, where a certain profanity came from. I like the term ninny hammer to call somebody pretty much an idiot. That was a fun one. And it's peppered with useful illustrations that show us. See, there's a cuckold right there. Ways that you can insult people, what they would mean, what would really get at people. And then she goes on to, with disgusting habits, violence, how the violence of men differed from the violence of women, how when women would attack each other, they would go for the head, because it was a kind of a complicated process of like getting braids in and underneath the hat. And if you could successfully rip all that out of a woman's arrangement on top of her head, then you pretty much won the fight. The way that they would insult each other. She goes into weapons of the time. Here we go to some dueling from rapiers. How before that, the proceeding was sword and buckler. How at one point you would basically look like, this deadly, intimidating figure if you walk around with a sword and buckler. And then just a generation later, you would look like an old geezer, because everybody else has rapiers. So the way that speech and language changed and associations changed. That's all in there. You go into table manners. There's some pretty great stuff. And we go repulsive bodies. This one was actually really interesting. This chapter on repulsive bodies. This is all right. I'm not going to explain that image. That one is really funny if you get to that. And what I love about these sorts of things, this type of social history especially, is that it deals with the sorts of questions and knowledge that you don't often find in history books, and that people think about and they question, but that it can be very difficult to find information about. So things like, where would you go to use the restroom, as we might say today, right? How did you wipe? Where did you go? What if you had like a runny nose, but obviously you don't have boxes of Kleenex? Even like female menstruation, all of that, all these sorts of things that we as just human beings have to deal with, but we have areas of privacy for this. We have disposable items that are specifically for that. And what they didn't have those sorts of things. So what was considered proper, what wasn't, how much does it change from the present day? I overall really certainly enjoyed this, and I can certainly see going back to this at some point and rereading it, and or at least going through different chapters and going through them again. I really liked this glimpse into the Tudor era. Ugh. I don't know why I'm having a difficult time with that. So anyway, Ruth Goodman. I should say that I know that she is very popular on British television. I think she's done a lot of stuff for the BBC programs, and she has other books as well. But I have not seen her much on American television, so she was a new person for me. But I've since looked up some stuff on YouTube and videos about her. But she seems very approachable, very, very funny woman. And in relation to Tudortember, another YouTube celebration that was going on was Shaketember, a celebration of Shakespeare. And there were, among the hosts, again, I don't have all the information right in front of me, they had chosen 4 plays to read and discuss, and I didn't follow that. Instead, I had the urge to go back to my favorite Shakespeare play and reread it, and that is Macbeth. And I didn't have a copy of it. I did at one point a long time ago. I think it was one of the mass market paperback Folgers ones. But I wanted something with a little more meat to it, so I can get some more historical context in. And I ended up picking up the Arden Shakespeare, which from my research seems to be the choice of scholars and more university level research and academic writing on Shakespeare. I went through. I read the introductory essay. I also I went through the play and I rewatched Roman Polanski's Macbeth, which is how I was introduced to Macbeth. That one came out in 1970 or 71, I think. And I still really like that movie. You can see, I mean, I know Polanski is a controversial person. I know that as a human being, he's pretty much a piece of crap. But I can't deny the power of his early filmography. I do love Repulsion. I love Rosemary's Baby. And in his adaptation of Macbeth, you can see the horror roots. And this is also right around the time when his wife was murdered by the Manson family. But there are terrific moments as a horror fan of gore, of certain supernatural terror, and I think that stuff is handled really well. It hits me in the stuff that I like. I had seen the newer version of Macbeth with Michael Fassbender, which I thought was beautifully filmed, but they do have a tendency to kind of mumble a little bit in that film too much, and they downplay the supernaturalism, which Polanski's film really embraces. That's one of the things I love about this play is this kind of haunted landscape, this medieval Scotland, 11th century Scotland that is peopled with ghosts and witches and, evil portents and illusions. It's, again, as a horror fan and as somebody who loves history and medieval history, it is just really right up my alley as far as setting goes. And Macbeth is just this exquisite, pull no punches tragedy. Macbeth is one of my favorite villains. I love his descent, his temptation at first to, steal the crown, to commit murder. And at first he has to be kind of talked into it by his wife, Lady Macbeth. I'm not going through the whole story. I mean, this is very famous. If you don't know Macbeth, I just say read it or watch a production. But Macbeth very quickly begins to take on the role himself of tyrant and murderer, and absolute megalomaniac. And I love the language in this. Of course, it helped to, I would say, define in Western culture a lot of what we think about witches. Fire burn, cauldron bubble, the language of the witches. You have the amazing speech, I think, that I still love, of Macbeth when, after Lady Macbeth dies, and he talks about life being, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. All those things I love. I love the language of this. But yeah, it's always been one of my favorites. And what I learned in this edition of the Arden, a little more historical context. This is after James ascended to the throne from Scotland. So Scotland was on the brains of the Elizabethan English, and as were questions of legitimacy and ascendancy to throne, all things that Macbeth touches on as a play. And also, James claimed descent from Banquo, which is, of course, a character in Macbeth, ill-fated, and has one of my favorite scenes of all of Shakespeare, at the dinner table, when people are telling Macbeth, hey, join us, and he says, there's no seat. And that's because it's being occupied by the undead, or something akin to it. So Banquo, in a lot of the original sources that Shakespeare would have been reading, was a co-conspirator. He was somebody who was a little bit more wicked, I think. But Shakespeare turns Banquo into something much more of a more innocent, a little bit more benign, if not noble, individual. And that probably is no doubt in due to Banquo being an ancestor of King James. So yeah, there were really nice historical context. So here's the family tree. James is on the top, and Banquo is down there on the bottom. Yes, and also this gives some context into productions, how, for instance, the witches were depicted differently throughout time. Uh, Certain things that, especially in the 1700s and 1800s, people took out of the play or what they added to it. They added a lot more witch scenes in there. So there's notes about that, notes about production and how it changed over time. And yeah, I enjoyed all that. And there's also plenty of footnotes as well. Explanatory language. So, if you have a difficult time reading Shakespeare, I would not suggest the Arden to start with. But if you can read the Shakespeare, okay, or even follow along with the production, read it at the same time. I think that this is an excellent option for people who want to dive more deeply into the history on a little bit of a higher academic level. So anyway, that's what I read at the end of September. First, well, just going to do it all at once here. So you got How to Behave Badly in Elizabethan England. We've got Rebecca, and we've got Macbeth. So all three books I thoroughly enjoyed. All right. Anyway, that's this edition of Fresh Read Kills, and I'll see you next time. Thank you, BookTube.